you've studied design at all or taken an art class, you've probably heard of the Gestalt Principles of visual perception. You might even have them memorized by heart, and even if you don't, there are plenty of great videos explaining what they are. But what you probably haven't seen is someone actually apply the principles to a bad design and turn it into a good design. Now, you might be wondering how we're ever going to take this design, which was intentionally made bad, and turn it into something even passable, let alone something you can get paid for. That's where the Gestalt Principles come in. We're going to take you step by step through a design process and show you how even the worst designs can be iterated on and improved without wasting time on a bunch of guesswork. But first, let's talk about what we're going to be designing. Essentially, it's a simple website landing page for a newsletter sign-up. It has a logo, navigation, with header, body text, subscription button, illustration, and a footer with a link to social media and copyright. The basic idea of this landing page is to convince a visitor to see we have a valuable newsletter to offer them and get them to click the subscription button. This isn't a Photoshop tutorial, but if you'd like to follow along, there's a download link for the starting and finished project file in the description below. The two typefaces we used are Brill Fat Face and Proxima Soft, also linked in the description. So what exactly are the Gestalt Principles? Put simply, they are observations of how humans identify relationships between and perceive visual elements. They can be utilized in any art or design that's visually based, but today, we'll be focusing on web design, and the first Gestalt principle we'll be utilizing is figure and ground. Figure and ground states that we perceive visual elements as either foreground figures that draw our focus, or ground, which is basically just the background that the foreground elements are in front of, or elements that we don't focus on. It's a pretty simple concept, but very important to get correct. So now that we know what figure and ground is, where do we start? In any iterative improvement process, it's usually a good idea to start fixing the most obvious issues first, so that the minor issues become more apparent. And one of the first things that jumps out is that our figure elements, the content, recede into the background because there's very little contrast between them. We don't want our figure to be confused for our ground. So let's up the contrast on all our content elements. The second thing to address is that we have these structural lines separating sections and elements of the design. Structure is a good thing, but these lines are perceived too much like figure rather than ground and distract the eye from the actual content elements. So we're going to remove them because we're either going to imply structure or make it explicit in a way that's not distracting later. Which leads us to the second Gestalt principle, uniform connectedness. The principle of uniform connectedness states that elements that are bound by a line or connected by a line are perceived to be related to each other. This line can either be an explicit element or implied structurally. Now that we've removed our explicit structural lines that were causing trouble with our figure and ground, we'll need some way to separate the main body content of our landing page from the navigation and footer. So, we'll make the background a different color and imply a common region for each section of the page. And because this principle is one of the most powerful for suggesting relationships, that's the only adjustment we'll need. Somewhat related to uniform connectedness, because it also deals with lines, is good continuation. This principle states that elements arranged on a line, straight or curved, are considered to be related. This is the principle that underlies text being arranged in lines. You may think the letters are perceived to be related because we can read them as a recognizable word, but even if we jumble the letters, they are still perceived to be related. The first thing we notice is the body text and header text being centered rather than left justified. Centered alignments have their place, but here it makes it harder to see that the two pieces of text are related. So we're going to make the body text left justified and make sure it's lined up with the title text. And we'll also line up the subscribe button. Next, up in the navigation, we're going to make sure that the bottom of the links are lined up with the bottom of the logo. While they're not the same thing as the logo, they are related to each other by being a structural element of the page, namely the header content. And we'll do the same thing with the social link and copyright in the footer. Finally, we're going to line up navigation and footer content with the main content. This isn't strictly necessary, but it won't hurt in this case and communicates that each section is part of the same page. The next thing to tackle is some spacing issues, which we'll fix with the principle of proximity. Elements close to each other are perceived to be more related. This principle is very simple and intuitive, however, it's also very powerful. Even though the circle and square elements contrast each other quite a bit, proximity still causes us to see two piles of related elements. The main issue when it comes to proximity with this design is the spacing between the header text and the body text and the subscribe button. There should be extra space between each of these elements so that it becomes clear there are three separate elements. First, we're going to increase the size of the text box containing the body, which will create more space between the subscribe button and the body text. And then move the body text down to create space between it and the header. The more minor issue with proximity is the navigation. The links are closer to each other than they are to the logo, but they could be closer. So let's do that to make the relationship stronger. The final principle we're going to cover is arguably the simplest, but probably the most important, and that's the principle of similarity. The principle of similarity is simplicity itself. Elements that are similar in appearance are perceived as being related. Elements that look different are perceived as less related. The big thing that the design currently lacks is contrast, i.e., there's too much similarity. Let's start with something obvious. The typeface for every piece of text is the same. While a serif typeface can look good for titles and small bits of text, everything else should really be sans serif. So, besides the logo, header text, and subscribe button, let's change the rest of the text to Proximus Soft, regular weight. Having a very limited use of our serif typeface already starts to give the viewer a better idea of where we want them to look. The second thing to address is some misapplied contrast in the navigation. Having the links all a different color makes the viewer think they're not related, when each of them is actually a link to different parts of the same website. Let's make them the same color. Next, there are big problems with size contrast. There's basically one size used for all textual elements, and that not only makes every element feel too similar, it also makes it hard to determine what's important. Remember the old adage, if everything is important, nothing is important. So keeping that in mind, let's adjust the size of our less important elements appropriately. Notice how we made the copyright text the smallest on the page, as it's by far the least important and arguably something that we never want someone to bother reading. After that, there's a big problem with the subscribe button. It's too similar to everything else on the page to stand out. As our main call to action on this page, it needs to stand out. So let's give it some color and some dimension to make it an obvious clickable button rather than just another piece of text. Finally, to finish off the design and make our main call to action slightly more noticeable, we're going to color the rest of our elements various shades and tints of blue to contrast with the orange even more strongly, as orange and blue are complementary colors. One last thing we'd like to add to this design before we call it done, and to illustrate that in the design process we tackle issues as they become more apparent and not in any set order, is that the illustration and subscribe button could be more related to each other to make it even more clear what we're subscribing to. They're not in close proximity, but we can't move the illustration without possibly creating more issues. So instead, we'll use the principle of uniform connectedness and add an explicit line connecting the two as if to say to a user, click here for mail. Phew! We'll call it done there. The design isn't perfect, no design is, but we'll leave it as an exercise for anyone following along to see what improvements they'd make to it. Regardless, look how far we've come from where we've started. We not only have a much better looking design, but more importantly, we have a design that's much more likely to achieve its objectives. If you have any questions about anything we did in this video or suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you liked this video, consider subscribing for more art and design videos in the future. Thanks for watching and see you next time.